Well, welcome back to the Drive Channel, and today I'm finally at a stage where I can properly test the 355. So today I'm going to go over the exterior, the interior, and then take it on a road test and give you some of my impressions, my driving impressions of the car. Now, I've had this one for a year and a half, and to be fair, the reason why it's taken me so long to do a proper road test on this car is because when I bought it, it was a bit of a work in progress. In fact, I have a whole series of videos on the Broco Barchetta, which is the nickname for this car, because it was rather Broco when I bought it. But it's less Broco now. There are still some things that I have to do, but they don't really affect the road test of the car. So let's start with the exterior of the car and just look at it. I've owned some pretty nice cars over the years, but I have to admit there's nothing that quite draws my attention than this 355. So let's take a minute and just look at the car. I have to say that owning this is something like owning a nice painting or something like that, because you could drive the car, but also I'm drawn to the garage quite a bit, as you might imagine, and I just wind up staring at it for a really long time. So I've probably wasted more time in my garage than I usually do, which is saying a lot because I spend a lot of time in my garage. So let's start with the basics of the car. So this was the first car that was really influenced by Luca di Montezemolo. He had a 348, and he famously said some very, let's say, derogatory things about his 348, because I believe he was beat at a traffic light by a much lesser car. And so when he took over the reins of Ferrari, this was the first car that he had an influence on. And even though this is based very heavily on the 348, it was completely reworked. In fact, it was reworked in such a way that the 348, which was a nice car, a desirable car, became the 355, which is the car that everybody had to have. So in fact, in the day, in the mid-90s, when this car was new, there were a lot of people who would prefer, and indeed bought this car, rather than the 550 Maranello, which was its contemporary, even though the 550 Maranello was more expensive and such a person could actually afford it. So this car has the stock 18-inch Speedline wheels, which I think are the best looking wheel that you can get on the car. I see a lot of folks on YouTube and other places like that who've put different wheels and wider tires on the 355, and there's practical reasons to do that if you're really into really heavy track work and performance, etc. But in my opinion, nothing has ever looked better than the original stock Speedline wheels that are very difficult to get nowadays. This one is in Rosso Barchetta, which is a very dark red, obviously, but it's a color that harkens back to the original Alfa Romeo racing colors, because of course Enzo Ferrari was the team manager for Alfa Romeo, and that's where he really cut his teeth on building racing cars and eventually, obviously, building street cars as well. So let's take a look underneath the hood. So if you want to put the the hood up. You just have to pull on this guy over here. And there it is. So the engine compartment of the 355 is very tidy. I just love the way that it looks. This is the later model, so this is a 1998 model, so you have Bosch 5.2. And 5.2, the biggest difference is that you have both intakes which come together, and you have the dual air boxes, but you only have the single mass airflow sensor. So that's a little bit of a detail that as soon as you open up the hood, if you really know your stuff, you'll spot that right away. Other things, inside the engine bay, this is a dry sump engine, 3.5 liters, 375 horsepower, and according to the factory manual, 0 to 60 is 4.7 seconds. Other things that you might be interested in, you have that's the filler tank that's the overflow tank for the coolant. You have your power steering up there, and yeah, so these air boxes here are metal. So the nice thing about Ferrari is that they use a lot of metal, where other manufacturers would probably use plastic. These are also numbered, so you have these should be one number apart. So yeah, 01R, 01L for left. And this is a 129, 129, AC 129. So that's, yeah, maybe that's interesting, maybe it isn't, but they are numbered. Now the 355 is hardly a GT car. It's really a sports car. This is their tiny sports car, but strangely enough, Ferrari did make a nod to having a little bit of room in the trunk. And so I brought my typical set of luggage that I use to test all of my cars, just to give everybody an idea of how much room there is underneath the front trunk lid in this case. And so all you have to do is just pull there's a little pull tab there. Up goes the lid. Now, do we think that this will all fit in here? Well, I don't know. I've actually never, this is the first time I'm ever testing it. So we got a rolly thing. See if we can put the rolly thing in. That fits quite nicely. Admittedly, this doesn't have anything in it, so that's probably why that has plenty of room. And then the two saddlebags. Remarkable. You actually have plenty of room inside the trunk. And yes, in case you're wondering, it will shut. Well, so first impressions when you get behind the wheel of the car. The driving position is kind of weird. I mean, it's unlike any car that I've ever driven. Maybe the closest thing, believe it or not, to this kind of driving position would be like a Honda Civic or something like that. The cowl is really, really low. It's like only a few inches above my knees. You have a nice instrument pod here, but it's actually, the dashboard itself is actually very, very far away. There's nothing in terms of fripperies here. So you have a nice steering wheel here, gigantic Cavallino badge on the steering wheel. All you have is an airbag and a very lovely high-pitched horn. The instrument pod there has oil pressure, water temperature, and your tach and your speedo. You have ancillary gauges here. I don't have it at the moment, but that is supposed to be an oil temperature gauge, which I still haven't swapped out yet. In the center, you have your fuel amount, and then you have a nice clock on the end. This particular car, I was lucky because I have the original radio. The radio is simply a Ferrari badge on a Sony unit. So you can just pop this, for security reasons, you can pop this off, this face off, and it says in big letters Sony on it. It's a good unit though, and it was used in a lot of cars as an aftermarket item in the past. And so what's actually very interesting about this radio, a quick factoid, is that it came from the factory in amber, but the gauge cluster in this car is green, unlike its predecessor, which was orange. So every single 355 came with a orange display on the radio. However, there's a secret. You could actually change it to green, but none of them were ever changed to green by the factory. So it was just kind of one of those things where they said, it's a radio. You're not going to be listening to the radio in this car. And believe me, if you have a tubing exhaust with an open valve, you won't be listening to the radio anytime soon. But I did actually replace the speakers, which disintegrated on this car. So it does, in fact, make music. Not bad. You have an interesting little door pull here. So this is how you open up the door. So it's kind of hidden. I really like that. And then you have your two windows, driver and passenger. In the center, you have in this center console here, you have buttons for locking the door, unlocking the door, your rear defrost, fog lights in the front, and yes, you have a separate lock and unlock button, which is really odd, because why not just make one button that goes in one direction to lock and another direction to unlock, but that's how they did it. On the side of the gated shifter, you have your hazard button, you have the interior dome lights, which in my car don't work, the fuel door release, which thankfully does work, and you have more parking lights. I think that's what that is. Actually, I'm not entirely sure. Then you have a nice center climate control system, single zone. You don't need anything more than that. And then behind that, you have a lovely ashtray, because back in the 90s, you could still have a proper smoke in your Ferrari. But not that anyone does that anymore. And then, of course, you have the buttons for the power mirrors right next to that. Other than that, what you see here is a lot of leather. You don't get much else. There are no buttons on the steering wheel. There are no flappy paddles. There's just a metal gated shifter from that originated in the 1950s in racing cars. So that's a very old looking feature. And you're surrounded by leather. And I've taken these door panels off. So this is leather. All of this is leather. I'm not sure what this hood liner material, this roof liner material is, but you have a nice leather wrapped sun visors and like a little, you have this nice little pocket over here to keep your registration in, I suppose. And the only accessory that I have hanging out in this particular car is my garage door opener. This car does have dual airbags. It's a 1998 model year. And I have decided that I'm going to keep all of the F1 badging, even though this car has been changed to a gated manual with 3 pedals. It left the factory as an F1, a 355 F1, and so I've decided that I'm going to keep the name, because just because you change jobs, you don't change your name. So that's my philosophy. Everything is wrapped in this lovely interior. This is a Ferrari saddle. That's it. It's not a particularly exciting name, but what's nice is that I still have, and I don't know if you can see this or not, I'm going to try to, I still have the Cavalinos on the back of the headrest. Now those do tend to, they kind of flatten over the years, but you can still see them. It's a nice little feature, but that's what you get in cars like this. You don't get a lot of extra fancy options like, electronics or navigation or anything like that. You just get a nicely leather-laden interior, and of course, all of the money goes to the engine in the back. And the other interesting thing about when you're driving this car is that the engine is right behind you. So this does not have really any parcel to speak of behind my head. It's basically seat, firewall, engine. And that's really remarkable, because every time the engine revs, it's quite an experience. You feel it right through your back. But let's get this car out on the road and see what it's like to drive. So here we are test driving the 355, and so the first impression that you get, I mentioned that the driving position is kind of odd, but weirdly enough, these Italian drive positions somehow work. The cowl is really low, and the steering wheel is angled away from you, but despite that, turn the air conditioning on, but despite that, the steering wheel is facing you perfectly. The gauges are easy to read, and although the vents for the air conditioning are far away from you, it really doesn't matter so much. So the first impressions that you get while driving the car is that the car is very dominated by the engine. So it's a lot of engine and a tiny little compartment for the people right out in front of it. As I mentioned before, the engine is right behind me. There really isn't much of a parcel shelf. It's like my back and then the engine. The steering is very light. That's something that was actually a big criticism of some of the recent road testers of this car. I don't remember if it was a big criticism back in the day, but it is definitely light steering. I don't personally think that this really detracts from the driving experience. Now, my particular car here has a tube exhaust, and the valve was removed, so it's a very loud car. So if it sounds like I'm shouting, that's really the reason why. Stuck behind a slow-moving Honda here. I can talk a little bit more about the engine. This car loves revs. The 355, the fun doesn't start until about 6,500 RPM. Now, from the factory, this car has an 8,600 RPM redline. However, it was tested at the factory to 9,000. At lower RPMs, the car, I find, is a little bit too much like a 308. So if you really want to have fun, start shifting it around 8. Definitely do not sit up high in this car. So everything, even Golfs, look like SUVs. Over the hood absolutely disappears in front of you, but it's easy to place on the road. Hello, big truck. Yay. Pops and bangs from the exhaust. Now, this is at a time when pops and bangs were not something that you paid extra for, a special pop tune. This is actually how the car came from the factory, although I'm sure it's aided quite a bit by the tubby exhaust. What a nice place to be, too. I absolutely love the beige interior. There's something very warm and inviting about it. It's very different than a black interior. When you have a moment to look around, you can see check out your oil pressure, oil temperature. Now, this car probably needs a little bit of a suspension upgrade. Now, there is a button here that I forgot to talk about. There's a sport button right here in the center console, and that will actually stiffen up the suspension a little bit. Mine seems to be working intermittent, so I think that my shock absorbers need to be rebuilt. Interesting factoid about the 355 Koni shocks that are standard on the car. They cost more to rebuild They cost more to rebuild than it is to buy new shocks. But if you really want to be original, that's the way to go. Oh, that sound! Yeah, there's not a lot of room for conversation if you have a passenger in this car. So there you have it, the Ferrari F355. Hopefully you got a little bit of a feel of what it's like to drive this car and what it's like to own it and some of the features that it has. Let me turn down the Arctic blast here. And I will see you guys in the next video.